The WHO is being co-opted by global elite forces to help take over world governance under the guise of health. And the excuse is to help prevent and respond to pandemics in a better way than before. We had 3 pandemics according to the WHO, in the 20th century. They were all influenza pandemics. 2 of them were barely noticed. One was 1918. It's not exactly clear what the cause of that was, but there was a high death rate. And ever since then, the excuse has been, we're going to have another 1918 and we have to prepare for it. And in particular in the US, since the year 2001, when we had the anthrax letter attacks and the Twin Towers, et cetera, attacks, the government has been spending about $10 billion a year to try and, supposedly, to try and prevent, protect, ameliorate biological warfare or pandemics. And the funding has been lumped together for influenza and pandemics, and efforts were made even before 2001 to get everybody in the United States to get a flu shot every year and to get used to it. Every August or September, you go in for your flu shot. So pandemics are said to be caused by mutations that occur naturally and may be due to spillover from animals. These are very rare and usually not very severe if they occur, but we don't know how often biological warfare occurs, which is another epidemic, pandemic, epizootic. Epizootic means transfers from animals to humans. So technically, that would be the term for all these things. We don't know how often an enhanced virus or bacterium exists that causes these things. What we do know is that certainly the original COVID was made in the lab. There's no question about that. There were many different, at least 10 different parts of the genome that appear to have been deliberately placed there to make it more pathogenic or dangerous, and it was made more transmissible. It's very difficult to prove the use of biological warfare. The only proof is if you know that it was done deliberately. If it escaped from a lab, you can't call it biological warfare. You call it an accident. You can't tell the difference. And sometimes the culling of animals in order to prevent an animal pandemic can, in fact, be a form of biological or economic warfare. Now, if the United States government and the WHO were serious about trying to prevent pandemics and biological warfare, it's fairly simple what they needed to do, and Andrew's already told us that. You shut down the labs, you stop doing the gain-of-function research, which is the biological warfare research. You don't do it, you ban it, you pay attention to the existing international law on this subject, and you strengthen the existing treaties. You also don't cover up the fact that SARS-2 came from a lab, but it was very important to maintain that fiction in order to bring forth this enormous biosecurity agenda. That was the plan of all our multinational institutions. And those included the UN, the EU, G20, G7, the World Bank, and the United States. They all wanted to fool us that pandemics come from animals, and we needed to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to protect ourselves. And this way we would ignore the lab origin. You have to realize that most of our Western governments have democratic constitutions, but essentially all of these multilateral organizations do not have democratic constitutions. They have undemocratic processes by which they work, and this has enabled them to be taken over by globalists for their own purposes. And so the WHO, and so the people who work at the WHO are their own bureaucracy, as well as diplomats who are sent from all the countries. And we can assume that most of the Western countries have sent diplomats who are in agreement or are working towards this same biosecurity agenda. Pandemic preparedness, planning, and response is another name for it. There's about 4 names. 2 years ago, using the excuse that we had not responded well to this last pandemic and that there was no equity and these poor African nations couldn't get vaccines, the claim was made that we needed a strong international treaty or 2 in order to make things better next time. And this was done without any after-action evaluation of how well nations or the WHO had performed. In fact, the WHO created a so-called independent committee to look at what it had done, and when that committee issued its report, it didn't look at what the WHO had done. It simply said, this is what we need to do next time. So I think that these 2 documents were basically created to fool the public, because nobody understands the differences between them. There's a lot of fine differences. But there was no treaty previously. There's never been a pandemic treaty. There is something called the Biological Weapons Convention, which was formed outside of the WHO, but is established within the UN now. So that is being drafted for the first time, and every time they come up with a new draft, they give it a new name. It's said that it probably won't pass because it requires a 2/3 vote and it requires nations to ratify or at least provide a signature afterwards. But if it does come into force, that will happen after 40 signatories, and it will come into force 1 month after the 40th, and it will be in effect 24/7. In other words, no declaration of a pandemic is necessary. It will always be enforced and always give the WHO powers. That's the treaty, which is currently called agreement. And the health regulations will require a declaration, and only during declarations will it give the WHO Director General powers. However, he can make a declaration for a potential pandemic, and he can extend the declaration beyond the end of the pandemic. These are just to try to simplify, there's a lot of complexity here. The biggest problems, in my view, in these 2 documents are they attack free speech, they require nations surveil their citizens' social media and censor them. They can tell you what medications you have to have, including vaccines, and tell you what you're not going to be allowed to have. They can force examinations on you. You lose privacy. They can swab you when they want. They get hold of your medical records and share them, and they look at what you're doing online and share that. There is a potential creation of new biological warfare agents. What these documents did, and they pulled back a little bit in the last version of the treaty after there was a lot of complaints, is what they directed nations to go out and find potential pandemic pathogens. That is the WHO's terminology, which means possible biological warfare agents. Nations are to go out and find them. When they find them, they have to build labs in every country, sequence them, study them, and share them with the WHO, which is creating a biohub and will share them globally with universities, pharmaceutical companies, and others. WHO also gets a blank check, both in terms of what it's going to spend on this huge program. It's building a new secretariat to manage biodefense for the world, and it also has a blank check in terms of how it's going to operate the system. And a Trojan horse called One Health has been created, which wraps up everything in the world into the basket of health, so that Tedros could declare an emergency because of a climate issue or a food issue. All right, now I'm going to first start on the amendments to the existing international health regulations. These regulations were put in place starting in the early 1950s, only for very limited purposes, such as a ship that leaves one country and somebody on board gets smallpox, it docks in another country. What do we do? So they created regulations for that purpose. Then they were expanded under Gro Harlem Brundtland. You remember her. In the early 2000s, she was probably working for the globalists then. Most likely they had this change in mind today, but they created a much broader set of international health regulations. Article 1 here, you see, said they were non-binding. They were advice, primarily, except for these situations where somebody comes off a boat with smallpox. The rest of it was advice. That has now been crossed out in these proposed amendments. And the amendments completely change the documents and expand it, tremendously. So what does binding mean? If the recommendations are binding, it means they must be obeyed. And as you saw already, this is Article 18. This existed in Article 18. These were part of the old regulations, but they were recommendations. They will become binding. In other words, the Director General can now order nations to perform these acts, such as requiring vaccines and vaccine passports. Another thing that was done to make this a binding document was take out the word may and change it to shall, or shall in international legal terminology means you must do it. It is mandatory. And so 168 shalls are in this new document. And they took out full respect for the dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms of persons. Crossed that out. And that wasn't a mistake, because in Article 2, they added that unnecessary interference right here. You weren't supposed to interfere with human rights unless it was necessary. I hope you see the irony in that. They also expanded the authority of the WHO, as I said before, to include potential risks to public health. Anything you think might be, drinking Coca-Cola could be a risk to public health. Now, if you actually go back to the WHO Constitution and look at what it's allowed to do, you find out that this international health regulations are regulations, and that middle section, Article 21 of the Constitution, tells you what regulations can do. Most of what we're talking about here is not allowed for regulations. So you either have to have a convention or an agreement, Article 19, in order to make these sweeping rules for people. But that's not what they did. They do have the agreement, but they also put this stuff into the international health regulations because they exist. And by amending them, they thought they could get by most governments without a sign-off. So in the United States, if the international health regulation amendments get a 50% plus one vote in the World Health Assembly at the WHO, there needs to be no ratification. They will be automatically implemented for every nation that is a part of the WHO and the international health regulations. 196 countries are parties to these regulations. So that's why they wanted to squeeze as much into this document as they could, but it's probably not legal because it's not a convention. Okay. Hope I made that clear. Here, they have to put in the fact that they're sharing these biological warfare agents. They know that's illegal according to the existing Biological Weapons Convention, so they have to put a smiley face on it. So how did they do that? They said, well, we're not going to share them with conflict or violence elements. I hope that makes you feel relieved. And this is where they put in coded language. In other words, only the lawyers are supposed to understand it. The ability to take away the hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin next time by saying that these health measures are disproportionate or excessive. And again, the way they censor you is slipping it into the section on collaboration. Yeah, the WHO will collaborate to help you censor false and unreliable information about public health events in your nation. And in terms of enforcement, people say it can't be enforced. No, it can be enforced. You've already been told a little bit about that. There are multiple ways within these documents they have created to enforce enforcement. These are 4 previous names of the treaty. I'm now going to move to the treaty, just so you know. You can see they're trying to make it very interesting. It's hard to find these on the website. I created Door to Freedom initially just to put all the documents in one place so people would be able to find them. This is the current version. This is probably not going to be the final version that gets decided on come May. And so now everything I talk about will be part of the treaty. And at first they tell you that they love information. They want everybody to have free access, unhindered and timely access to transparent information. But they do define infodemic as being too much information, as well as false or misleading information. However, you move down in the pandemic treaty a little further and you find out the nations must perform infodemic management. And then it gets worse. They have to combat false, misleading, misinformation, or disinformation because they must promote trust in science. They talk about health coverage all over the place. The WHO, the UN, it's all about health coverage, coverage. They want you to think they're giving you health care. They are not. They're going to require you to buy health insurance. Nations are being required to pass laws to create a legal, administrative, financial framework in order to carry out the orders of the WHO. This is a usurpation of sovereignty. And they're requiring nations to put in place, in law, the ability to get vaccines out to their populations without being licensed. The fastest COVID vaccine took over 300 days, that was Pfizer, to get an emergency use authorization. The plan is to do this in 100 days. 100 days for development, 30 more days for manufacturing in the future. And just in case you weren't quite sure that this had to be, you cannot push a vaccine out in 100 or 130 days, not test it in humans, and assume it's going to work or be safe. Never has. Most vaccines fall by the wayside during the testing period, which is normally about 10 to 15 years. And so liability had to be removed from these products. And in 3 paragraphs, they tell you 3 different ways there must be no liability for these rapidly produced vaccines. No fault vaccine injury, indemnity clauses, and they're very specific. This is for novel vaccines and pandemic vaccines. That means no liability for the WHO, for the manufacturer, for the doctor, for the nation. And they have already created the system for sharing these potential pandemic pathogens that all the nations are supposed to go out and find or take out of their freezers. And they tell you how. You have to make it legal, because this is proliferation of biological weapons. So we have to create some legal structure, some fig leaf, so that these people who work at the WHO and et cetera, can't be strung up for doing this later. And here you have it straight from the WHO website, the BioHub system, and they say, I'm reading it to you, sharing of biological materials with epidemic or pandemic potential will be done through one or more of the labs designated as a WHO BioHub. However, I got to tell you, the United States actually follows the Biological Weapons Convention, which says you can't proliferate these organisms. And so in the United States, if you're studying potential pandemic pathogens, you have to register them with the CDC, and you have to get permission before you can transfer them to the WHO or the BioHub or anywhere else. You can't just do it against the law. And so for the labs in the US that study these organisms, there are 200 reports a year of accidents. And their yearly reports, you can find them on the internet. They've started now this year putting them they're archived. You have to go to the Wayback Machine to find them, but they're there. So 895 people actually had to go see a doctor because of a potential exposure in 1 year in the US alone. So this is what happens when you start frigging around with these microorganisms. You have to have accidents. The animals that you have infected will bite the lab workers. The lab workers will stick themselves with a needle when the animals are getting frisky. There is no way to stop these things from happening. Okay, what is One Health? As I said, it's a Trojan horse. It is a concept that makes no sense but has been instituted worldwide at the cost of many billions of dollars in order to wrap the whole world up into a basket that can be handed to Tedros for his control under this whole biosecurity regime. No one has been able to define it. There are 61 published definitions, but the organization made up of 4 international agencies, their best definition is integrated unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems. It recognizes the health of humans, domestic and wild animals, plants, and the wider environment, including ecosystems, are closely linked and interdependent. In other words, it means nothing. But it addresses the collective need for clean water, energy and air, safe and nutritious food, and taking action on climate change and contributing to sustainable development. And the Lancet has their own One Health Commission, and they admitted one of its main purposes is to galvanize transformations in global governance. Here's the WHO and its budget for this year. This was updated last February. The light green, this is all voluntary contributions that have been earmarked, that are specified. The WHO doesn't get to decide how to spend that money. This here, this is dues. They get to decide how to spend that. This is money they're hoping for. This is thematic voluntary contributions, which is maybe a partial earmark. And this purple is voluntary contributions that they can spend as they like. You can see that in this chart, 73% of all the budget that the WHO gets has been specified by its donors, and the donors call the tune at the WHO. So you can say it's an organization of 194 members, and then 2 other extra members of the health regulations that aren't members of the WHO, like Liechtenstein and the Vatican. But you have to realize they do what their donors tell them to do. They are not really independent. Okay, it's always nice to put a face and a name together. You know the person in the middle, but the person on the right over here at the World Economic Forum, he's also always at the G20 meetings. He's everywhere. His name is Sir Dr. Jeremy Farrar. He was a co-discoverer of bird flu and has kept hyping the fear of bird flu, even though it's mutated. It's not a danger at all anymore. He masterminded the proximal origins cover-up, in other words, making us think COVID came from a bat rather than a lab. He funded and supervised 2 major overdose trials of hydroxychloroquine to make it appear that the drug did not work for COVID. In other words, he was responsible for overdosing about 2,600 people, of whom more than 25% in the UK died. He was head of the Wellcome Trust, but he took a big demotion to move to the WHO last year, where he is going to be, and he co-founded CEPI, the organization that came up with the 100-day vaccines, okay? So he's the 100-day vaccine man. He moved to the WHO to bring these 2 documents forward and to bring in the 100-day vaccines. This is CDC. It takes 10 to 15 years to make a safe vaccine. And I'm just going to summarize again what I started to say in the beginning, and I tell you in most cases where it is in the documents. Sovereignty is in fact ceded because the WHO tells the nations what laws they have to pass and what they must do. The documents lie because they use language improperly. They say there is regulatory strengthening, but then they tell you that there must be regulatory weakening. They tell you they are managing liability, but they're actually removing liability. They tell you there will be universal health coverage. They don't tell you you're paying for it, and they're not asking for any more doctors or nurses or clinics. They're asking for insurance. They're trying to help the insurance industry. They promise unfettered access to information. So the diplomats can point to that part of the document and say, oh, see, we're doing the right thing. But then later in the document, they require censorship. They're going to create more pandemics. They're not going to save us from them. They're going to start them, and then they're going to control us using them. They have come up with this One Health concept, which, as I said, is built into national legal frameworks now. So in the United States, our federal agencies are required to implement One Health proposals, and in your countries too. I mean, even in the states, at the state level, some of this is happening. And in the United States has given grants to over 50 countries to implement One Health. You know, I gave a talk a few months ago, and somebody in the audience raised their hand and said, I just got a master's degree in One Health. Human rights, dignity, and freedom of persons have been discarded, and the WHO can withhold medications. All right, if you want to reach me, the bottom is how you find me. This organization, Door to Freedom, that I created has lots more information, including handouts, and those handouts are in about 10 languages. And I wrote a very long article about contextualizing all of this, explaining more about the vaccines, myocarditis, where this is going globally. And so that is this article here, which you can find on the website. And we've tried to create a lot of different kinds of materials so that we have 30 or 40 articles that are only about 500 words that you can read in 2 minutes. So we want 12-year-olds to understand, as well as college professors, and there's information about other aspects of the Great Reset. So I thank you very much for listening. Glad to be here.